Hey guys, welcome back to Total Tactics FPL. It's Fran here, and I'm back with the Game Week 5 cheat sheet. Extremely short turnaround from Game Week 4, so there really weren't too many lessons learned from Game Week 4 that I think have drastically changed our estimation of FPL players. And simply because we have so many top 4, top 6 players that have looked interesting so far, I can't really see the value of too many transfers being made. I do think Brighton continues to be an emerging defense, and even though the fixtures are getting slightly worse, I would say they are still a very, very interesting team, and a lot of people are looking to move towards the Brighton defense. And simply put, assets like Gross and Rodrigo have done so well so far that a lot of people are still looking for ways to get into an upgrade over a Neto and a Bailey that we started the season with. As far as 4.9 to 4.5 to 4.9 midfielders, we have Pereira and De Silva. Pereira's simply the best asset because Fulham will soon have really good fixtures, and De Silva just doesn't seem like someone who we can actually rely on consistently to get points. If you're actually playing a lot of starting 11s with De Silva, I have recommended and advised so far for people to look for a different starting 11 and to incorporate someone like at least a 4.5 defender to cover De Silva, because you want to have someone who's more consistent, can actually have more expected points going forwards, as opposed to an asset who I would say is scoring from very, very low expected opportunities and doesn't really hold as much value and permanence in our teams. As far as 5.0 to 5.9 assets, Gross and Aronson have effectively swapped places. I just really like the attacking position that Gross is finding himself in to actually go for goal scoring opportunities. It's not really just a fluke. I think we've seen consistency from him for at least 4 weeks now, and I think his position has changed in this Brighton team. We have always seen, I think, year to year where a lot of Brighton assets seem to be emerging simply because of how roles change, and part of that too is things like Mope getting shifted out of the system, Welbeck being incorporated, and Gross now getting much more effective attacking touches, and that's simply why he's now the top asset around this price tier, especially since so many people are looking at the 6.3, 6.4, 6.5 assets. That Gross at such a cut rate price with so many holes so far does seem extremely tempting, and I do think he's a little bit more interesting than someone like Aronson, even though Aronson has great fixtures going ahead, just because I feel like he's going to get more expected goals and potentially even in more goals in the future to back up the expected numbers he's built up, whereas someone like Aronson is much more creative as an asset and I think has a lower ceiling, and that's why I've adjusted things between the two of those players. As far as Eze, Gray, Gordon, even players like rotation news and his injury news is actually very important for Eze owners, because Zaha is probably the most interesting asset for Eze to unlock in that Crystal Palace team. As far as Gray and Gordon, we've seen them both score from 2 game weeks now, and I do think Gordon is actually the more interesting asset. He is someone who gets more opportunities, creates more of them himself. I'd say he's probably less of a clinical finisher than someone like Demarai Gray, but he is, for me, the more interesting player between the two. I just can't see the value really in going for them because Everton are such a poor team in my mind, and with Liverpool and Arsenal ramping up as fixtures, I just think it was a short-term opportunity. If you jumped onto Gray or Gordon 2 weeks ago, fair enough, you probably collected a haul that was worthwhile, but it is very soon going to be the time to actually move out of those assets. As far as Neto, though, you have Bournemouth and Southampton, two very, very good fixture opportunities here to actually do well. He's dropped into a 5.3 price, and I think he's still a very interesting asset. I think one thing that I would say about Neto is he doesn't seem to combine very well and create effective attacking opportunities independently. He's someone who we would expect to finish chances on him by himself because he's so direct, but I don't think he's the most creative player when it comes to finding the right cross or finding the right passing opportunity for some other players. I think Guedes, actually lower down in this cheat sheet, is a little bit better at that. And Guedes did actually fluke his assist versus Newcastle, but we have seen him create much more interesting attacking and goal scoring opportunities for this team than Neto, in my opinion. I think Neto is someone who, because the fixtures are so good on paper, you do expect him to find opportunities to score, and I think that's why he's risen as an asset versus Bournemouth and Southampton, although I think Guedes is actually the more complete, more efficient asset. 6.0 to 6.9, I've talked about Guedes and why he's risen, so there you go. As far as St. Maximin, he's someone who had a cracking goal versus Wolves. I do always say that he's the more interesting asset when Wilson's injured, and this is exactly the time for him to be more interesting asset. I haven't really risen him to a green asset so far, and that's simply because St. Maximin unfortunately has to play Liverpool next. Maybe next week we'll see him rise towards the top, and the fixtures there are for the taking for Newcastle, because game week 6, 7, and 8 are all interesting fixtures, to be honest. We know that they play very well at home, and West Ham haven't really been as good as a side where I would say it makes sense to wait until game week 8 to go to go into a Newcastle asset. I think Game Week 6 is already an opportunity to move into a Newcastle asset, and holding your transfers until then will give you the chance to actually assess whether you want to keep players like Rodrigo or even like Martinelli, or find a way to push into someone like Saint-Maximin, maybe triple up on some of these 6-point-X midfielders who are providing a lot of value once again this season. Rashford, Odegaard, Trossard, Harrison, these are all players, even including Rodrigo, Martinelli, where my estimations on them have not changed. The key issue, I would say, with someone like Rashford is him playing centre forward is such a stark change to when Martial plays, because Martial is so good at holding the ball up and actually enabling other people, and his ability to play back to goal and actually feed players in is so different to someone like Rashford playing centre forward. I just don't really like Rashford centre forward. I still always think he's going to be at best a left inside forward, and unfortunately he's not playing this role so far. With Martial out, I don't see him having the same partnership with Cristiano Ronaldo. So simply put, I think Rashford is a worse asset because of that, and especially with teams playing a lower block, and I would say even potentially giving a better defense than what Liverpool displayed at Old Trafford. I think it's going to be tough for Rashford to find great opportunities, especially with Arsenal and Crystal Palace being tough games seeded in this kind of four match fixture run. With Odegaard, the reason why I haven't risen him towards the level of Martinelli is because his expected numbers have not married up there. I think he's still taking a lot of long shots, and he's been a little bit lucky so far. I don't really expect him to be consistently scoring an outside the box goal week on week. Maybe I'll be wrong, and maybe he'll score once again versus Aston Villa, because Aston Villa are a pretty poor team, if we're being honest. But I don't see Odegaard really marrying up to the eye test so far in terms of how good he is on paper with the underlying stats as well, compared to someone like Martinelli and Rodrigo. Rodrigo is still, for me, the interesting asset compared to Harrison as well. So similar to the reason why Odegaard, for me, still falls short compared to Martinelli, I still think that the same argument can be made for Harrison and Rodrigo. Harrison has created a lot of better expected assist numbers than Rodrigo, but because Rodrigo and the way points work in FPL is you're benefited more for goals, I just simply can't see the value of going for Harrison over Rodrigo if you have the choice. If you are price locked, I can understand moving into assets like Harrison, but perhaps the Odegaard and Martinelli situation is a little bit worse because Odegaard is more expensive than Martinelli. So that's how I see things so far. With Martinelli getting so many minutes, you don't see that deviation between Odegaard yet, because Odegaard is someone we expect to get 90 minutes per game, whereas Martinelli, with previous history, was getting much less minutes. But I think so far under Arteta, he's deserved a lot of 90-minute games, and he's received that so far. So that's why Martinelli is still, I would say, one of the top assets here, and nothing's really changed when it comes to the midfielders. With the second part of the midfielders, we have the 7.0 to 7.8 price range players. Bernardo's the only player who's actually risen here, and the reason why is because Bernardo has just shown, once again, that he's quintessential to this Pep team. He's played minutes at right wing, at centre mid, and even sometimes, as we said, as a sweeper, CDM. And the thing with Bernardo really is, with the expected minutes being there, he's always going to rise towards the top because he's actually been well priced this year at 7.0. His expected goal involvements have also increased from the previous year, so that's a really good sign to actually suggest that Bernardo is going to be an emerging asset. And I feel like the reason why Gundogan is still at the top here compared to Bernardo is because Gundogan has been employed mostly in attacking positions, and for me, my concern with Bernardo isn't his minutes, but more so what position he's deployed in, depending on the game. I think there are times, for example, when, let's say, Kevin De Bruyne is out of the team, that Bernardo gets to occupy more frequently these attacking roles, but sometimes we also see him being relegated to playing almost like a centre mid and not being very involved in kind of key attacking interactions with the City team. So for me, it's a little bit more of a wait and see, or even a wait and hold with Bernardo. You could preemptively go into Bernardo because he is well priced, as we mentioned. But I would like to kind of employ a little bit more of a passive strategy and go into Bernardo perhaps later on in FPL. I still think Gundogan is the more interesting asset short term, especially since he got that rest in Game Week 4. So I expect him to start in Game Week 5 and potentially have a mega haul versus Nottingham Forest. As far as Zaha, the reason why I put an asterisk on him and not change his position is because, for me, what I've seen so far from Zaha is that he's been fantastic, and this Crystal Palace team definitely can have the ammunition to score versus any team in the league. We saw that versus Man City just last week, and that was with a Zaha-less squad. I think Zaha's still actually the best finisher in this Crystal Palace team. He's the penalty taker too, someone who can actually drive and actually earn penalties himself, and with the help of someone like Eze, I think he's just going to do tremendously well this season. So for me, Zaha still remains as one of the top tier assets in the game. It just really depends on whether he's actually able to play this weekend. Potentially, if you're able to get him later on in FPL, it makes sense. I think definitely when you're looking at 6, 7, and 8, the fixtures don't look too good on paper, because we do know that Newcastle's a very good defense at home. United have improved so far, but Crystal Palace have always done well versus United, especially at home. And then also being being able to face Brighton at home is also another huge upgrade there. So I think with Crystal Palace playing at home with some of those tougher fixtures, you still might be interested in going for Zaha. It just seems like there might be a tiny little bit more upside going for someone like Gundogan this week when you have that Nottingham Forest fixture and you know he's going to play. As far as the 7.9 assets, nothing's really changed other than Diaz rising to the top and Mount conversely rising all the way to the bottom once again with another drop this week. Diaz has risen simply because of the great performance versus Bournemouth. This is another opportunity for him to lock in his minutes and his spot in the team. Another great performance, especially where Salah had a blank, but had great goal-scoring opportunities himself. I would say actually puts Diaz in a position where he's potentially one of the more interesting attackers that Jurgen has to keep week to week, even if we know Jota and Darwin are coming back. And for me, I would say Firmino really was poor in the United fixture. I thought versus a much tougher defense that was constantly pressing, that he was struggling to actually get onto the second touches. He clearly redeemed himself in the Bournemouth game, but I would say going forwards, especially with some of the tougher matches where you're faced with tougher defenses and much more physical defenses, the games are actually better on paper for Diaz, in my opinion, than someone like a Firmino. And I really like for Liverpool's fixtures as long as they actually find their footing, and they seem to have done so. So Diaz for me rises to the top. Both Saka, Maddison, Kulusevski, Foden, these are all assets who I think have done well so far this season. I think Saka has underscored our expectations, but because Arsenal's fixtures are still very, very good on paper, I think Saka still remains, unfortunately, as one of the top assets. If you have the opportunity to move into Diaz, I'd actually probably wait 1 week for the transfer to move away from Saka to Diaz. But for all these other assets here, I think this is still an interesting opportunity to move into Diaz, with maybe exception to Foden, because Foden has such a great game on paper himself. If you're a Mount owner, if you're a Bowen owner, I think this is simply the opportunity to move into Diaz as well. And that's how things are, because Mount has shown a lot of poor form, and unfortunately even Tuchel has kind of recognized that with a lot of the early substitutions of Mount, and it's continually been depressing, I would say, for Mount owners, unfortunately. With Sterling, he's the one differential here who is actually making a dent into FPL. Some people might question whether and why specifically Salah might not have dropped this week. I would say the reason is simply because at this sort of price range, I'm still expecting Salah to do well. His underlying numbers aren't really far off from what we expect, and we know he always tends to overshoot those expectations and perform well. So I think it's only time that he very shortly returns to the mean and actually gets these kind of hauls that we expect from him and come to know from him from the previous year. So I still think Salah's a top asset, especially since the fixtures are so green. For De Bruyne, he had a pretty poor game last week out. I thought he was a little bit tired, and he did get rest, but only really for 3 to 4 minutes. So I think this might be an interesting fixture where Pep could have an opportunity to even rest De Bruyne if he considers De Bruyne to be a little bit tired. Potentially he won't do that. This is an interesting fixture where I think a lot of people deliberately have gone off of Haaland to capitalize on De Bruyne as a captaincy option versus Nottingham Forest. And I'm a little bit worried that things have almost swayed in the opposite direction, where Haaland just looked so inspired and so fit in the Crystal Palace game, and De Bruyne actually conversely did not. So what I'm concerned about here is De Bruyne is still a top asset for me, but whether he's actually worth a differential captaincy this week is a different question altogether. And with Son showing such poor form and Sterling actually getting a brace with a very interesting and great finish, with the good expected numbers as well so far, something that's actually very close to Salah when it comes to expected goals per 90, I would say Sterling is a very interesting early differential that you could jump on. I do like the Southampton game on paper. Southampton have actually been a relatively good defense so far. They've had tough fixtures too, playing Spurs so far. I just think though that this Chelsea team is in a sense built around Sterling being the focal point, and he is starting to take advantage of some of the opportunities, such as, for example, a Reece James cross, which is something that you can actually expect week on week to be delivered. And I do think he's the one where if you really, really are desperate to move out of Salah, I'd probably actually go for him first if you own Haaland in your team, as opposed to going for both De Bruyne and Haaland as a double up. So that's the one thing that I think has made a small dent into the fixtures, but I still think Salah and De Bruyne are the better options just in isolation. As far as the forwards, we have one change here, which is Welbeck rising towards the top. I do think Mitrovic is the standout best option around here, but I do think Welbeck actually does marry up to a lot of the other 6-point-X options in the game quite well. And the reason is simply because Welbeck is part and parcel to this Brighton attack. We mentioned how this team has changed quite a bit, how a lot of the offensive responsibility has changed, and the expected numbers have moved away from, a team basically building chances exclusively around Mopé. And I really like Welbeck and his ability to get people involved in play. So similar to Tony, I think he's someone who could find assists as well and could be quite an interesting forward going forwards. As far as Mitrovic, I do think it's a little weird to actually move him in this week. Brighton's a tough game, and then you have Tottenham and Chelsea, which are going to be tough games too. We have seen him effectively be fixture proof as a striker, but I would say it still makes the most sense to bring him on game week 8. Potentially, we've actually missed a lot of opportunities to have some great Mitrovic points. But simply put, I do think a lot of forwards have shown that they have been able to match someone like Mitrovic in a better fixture run. So someone like Tony, for example, has done well so far. But I can completely understand why managers would have moved into Mitrovic now. He's always been a top option in this cheat sheet, and he's only going to get better. So that's the interesting thing there. As far as 7.0 to 7.9 players, Watkins drops because the next two fixtures are really, really tough. Arsenal and Man City, the two best defenses in the league so far. And Leicester and Southampton, obviously, that's when fixtures get a little bit easier for Aston Villa, but they have looked really terrible as a team. I mean, getting 0.4 XG versus West Ham is no small feat. I do really think they are one of the poor teams here, especially as we know they also lost to Bournemouth early on in the season. I do think this is an interesting time, especially for even considering whether Gerrard's going to stay in place in this team and what that means for someone like Watkins. But moving on, I think Firmino and Darwin's another interesting sort of element to talk about. I've given Firmino new life on the cheat sheet, and I've given Darwin a rise, and I've matched them towards the same level because I do think over time Darwin actually find starting opportunities once again over Firmino. I just didn't like how Firmino was able to play versus United, and I think every year we do get 2 to 3 fixtures where Firmino does absolutely have an astoundingly good game, but I don't think he's someone who at his age and at this kind of current level that we've seen so far will actually marry that up with consistency week on week. So I really think Firmino is at best going to be a third tier option. I understand some people would have got some crazy differential hauls with Firmino last week, but I really don't think that that's going to be repeatable so far. I think in the tougher fixtures, especially even though we've made Newcastle a green option or even Everton as a green option, I don't really see him getting that involved in those fixtures, whereas I do see Darwin potentially being interesting coming off the bench. And going forwards, I still am a lot more confident in Luis Diaz and Salah's options until basically minutes are a little bit more set in stone for someone like Darwin. As far as the Haaland and Kane kind of contributions there from these premium assets, I think they both have great fixtures going forwards. One thing about Haaland, of course, is going to be rotation, but because he looked so good for Crystal Palace and was such a difference maker, I do think it's still an eye test here on whether you actually want to keep Haaland as a captaincy option this week. I think he does seem a little bit more interesting on paper compared to someone like Salah, who is facing a rather tough Newcastle defense, albeit at home. And then Kane, someone who's playing West Ham, who have, for the most part, shown some really, really poor form so far. So what I would say is, as a Haaland or Kane owner, I would be very happy with the trajectory both players have going forwards, and obviously they will line up to meet each other at game week 7. I still think I'm more towards the Haaland camp, and I'm probably going to keep him over these fixtures, and I'm not really going to consider the pivot towards KDB, even though some people have already preemptively done that. I just think Haaland's expected numbers are just sky high. They're basically some of the best numbers that we've seen ever in the Premier League. So I just think he's one to keep, and that's pretty much how the forwards are laid out. Moving on to the defenders, I would say this is a position where we haven't seen too many changes in FPL. Patterson is someone who I've dropped compared to Nico Williams, and that's just to illustrate that Nico Williams for me is the best option going forwards. You have that Bournemouth fixture, which is going to be a great opportunity to potentially capitalize on Nico Williams getting a clean sheet, especially since Nottingham Forest have actually been a really poor defense so far, but because Bournemouth is so equally poor on attack, I would say this is a great fixture on paper for Nico Williams to maybe get something out of the expected goal involvement that he's been creating so far. I would say he's very raw when it comes to his ability to find the right man in the box, but because he's actually overloading so many crosses and so many kind of key opportunities, even in a game where he didn't get many set piece opportunities, I think he's actually off corners now, and that was illustrated in the Spurs game. He still had very, very good expected goal involvements, and that's because he's so active around the area. So I do really like him going forwards, because there is a lot of upside there from a 4.0 asset, which is all you want to see. With Emerson, he's got 45 minutes and just isn't an interesting asset just yet, especially with the fixtures being so tough for West Ham. As far as the 4.1 to 4.9 range, we have Saliba and Dunk, and even Estupiñán, who's actually been arguably added to the cheat sheet as an option. I prefer Estupiñán over any of the other 4.5 options at Brighton, with exception to Dunk, because Dunk is someone who we will see get a lot of minutes going forwards. He's someone who I think is nailed 90 minutes, where someone like Veltman is still an injury concern at times, and maybe will get rotated from time to time with someone like Lamptey. And Estupiñán has a lot of upside that we already saw within the one fixture. The one thing about Estupiñán is you are gambling on a lot of upside, but I do think going forwards he will be the starting left wing back, because we've already seen a role that Trossard can actually play when Estupiñán actually plays left wing back. So that's why I think Estupiñán makes a lot of sense. If you're an upside chaser, I think that's the right move. If you're a little bit more risk averse, I would say Dunk is the right move to make too, alongside with Sanchez as a goalkeeper. But Brighton defense is definitely a team that you want to get a little bit of coverage over because they've shown such great statistics so far and also backed it up on paper. With Fofana, he's going to be an interesting option. I've considered him as a Chelsea option here, so a little bit preemptive. Maybe the here we go doesn't happen this week, but Fofana is the right option, I would say, to go for if you are looking for a little bit of coverage of this Chelsea defense and you have a little bit more faith than most, I guess, over this team. He is 0.4 over someone like Nico Williams, but I think there are still very limited opportunities to actually play Nico Williams in your team. So if you were to, let's say, space out your team with a back five, potentially Fofana is the one to watch, because I would say he's going to be nailed in that Chelsea team once he joins, and he's also going to hopefully enable someone like James going forward. So Fofana is one to watch for the future. As far as Dalot, he's also risen. I mentioned how interesting he could be as an asset in FPL, and the reason why Malacia doesn't find himself on the cheat sheet is because Dalot is, for me, the more interesting option when it comes to FPL. I think he is someone who will find himself in more attacking positions, and potentially Malacia in more defensive games will actually get more bonus points because of him getting much more kind of defensive tackles in and things like that, which also contribute to bonus. I would say Dalot just has much more upside and is the defender that I'd like to go for this Man United team, because ultimately, even if Dalot you see himself as a weak defender, that doesn't matter for FPL. The clean sheets are lost between all the players, and the attacking upside is only really shared by someone like Dalot himself. As far as the 5.0, 5.4 players, we have no movements there, and that's simply because Ake's injury still means that he's probably a second tier option at best. I would probably have already moved away from Ake so far if you were an Ake owner, simply into someone like Perisic or even Cucurella, or even just a Walker, which is a side grade transfer. But United have, or City rather, actually have really good fixtures still. Nottingham Forest and Aston Villa are both fixtures that I think are actually quite easy clean sheets on paper, and I don't see things changing. What I do like about Ake is that potentially, if let's say Laporte's injury is derailed and his timeline is further delayed, then Ake can still be a great option, and he does have the upside of actually being someone who can score a lot of aerial headers, and we saw that already in the preseason games so far, and it seems like Pep does actually rate him quite well, which is why he was actually starting over Ruben Diaz in the Newcastle game until he got injured. As far as the 5.5 options, Perisic is someone who rises to the top, with Diaz actually dropping this week. And the reason why I don't like Diaz is because I do think he actually can be covered safely by Walker. We've seen Pep show a lot of faith with Walker, especially with the tactical changes when they moved into a back three structure as they were trying to recoup that game versus Crystal Palace. And Walker was the one who actually stayed on, which was really positive, I would say. Cancelo still remains as a top option for me because Nottingham Forest and Aston Villa are both games I mentioned where a City can get clean sheets. And usually in games where City get clean sheets, regardless of whatever the expected goal involvement is of Cancelo, we actually do end up seeing him as one of the top bonus threat options, because as long as the game is relatively low scoring, he will still be very involved with a lot of touches, and he'll create a lot of opportunities for himself to get bonus points. So that's why I like Cancelo so much for these next two fixtures, and I really wouldn't transfer him until game week 6. At the earliest, but still, that's only if you're moving into a Newcastle defender. For now, I would say Cancelo is probably still a keep. Diaz, the reason why I've dropped him is because Walker simply exists as a cheaper option, and I do think the expected minutes are very similar, and you just have so much money that you can actually save by going to Walker. The upgrade is worth, or the downgrade is actually worth it. As far as Chilwell, he's dropped. I actually expected him to play versus Leicester, and Cucurella starting at left wing back was a little bit of a surprise, because it really does show that Tuchel probably doesn't have any faith whatsoever in Chilwell's current state of fitness, and I think that's a huge positive side for Cucurella owners, but unfortunately a huge kind of downside for Chilwell owners. Potentially he might get a start in the next 3 fixtures because there will be rotation, and Chelsea will also be involved in European competition, but for now I think Chilwell is just way too overpriced, and especially when you have options like Fofana creeping up as Chelsea options, he's simply an avoid. Moving on to the keepers, we don't have too many changes. I've actually included Raya as the top option now alongside Sanchez, and that's simply because I think the main difference and why I consider Brighton defenders to be better than the Brentford defenders is because I do think this Brighton team is actually going to be getting clean sheets more often, and they're actually reducing the amount of shots that they're receiving. So that is a huge plus for a defender. That's where you actually would be a little bit safer with a clean sheet. Whereas with Brentford, the big difference between Raya and Sanchez is Raya will have to make a lot more saves than Sanchez, and in a sense that could marry up to the points that Sanchez will get with the additional clean sheets, whereas you can't get that get those points back really between the central defenders. They'd have to actually outscore through actually scoring or contributing through an assist. So that's the key change there, and why, for example, within the defenders we have Brentford as a second tier option, whereas here I think they are almost close to equal, because Raya's putting in some fantastic performances, and we now know basically at this stage in the season that he's going to play towards the end of the season, and the replacement for Raya will only come and start playing next year. As far as Henderson, he's someone who has had crazy hauls so far, 2 penalties saved, and the all-time penalties saved statistics are great. I just don't see him actually conceding as many penalties on average, let's say. Definitely not 2 out of 4 games. That sort of 50% penalties metric is a little bit too high right now. I would say this is just a little bit of a small sample size situation. And I do think that, especially with the defense being so poor, that Henderson will lose quite a few more clean sheets and therefore won't be as interesting as an option as he does seem to appear now with the amount of points he's hauled so far. So I do rate him similar to Mesley, but probably still a little bit better. If anything, I'd probably just drop Mesley towards the tier of Pickford going forwards, and maybe when Henderson's fixtures are a little bit easier, so let's say after the City game, or even if you wanted to consider a wild card, you could move into Henderson, and maybe around that time I'd probably have him as a top option. We'll see what happens. This Nottingham Forest team is interesting because they've had a lot of transfers in, and it does take time to gel. It does take time to find the right defensive solutions to things, to actually be a little bit more creative and direct in attack and not be so, I would say, side pass heavy. And it will take time. So I think maybe this Nottingham Forest team could ramp up, and we'll see, and maybe adjust our expectations on someone like Henderson going forwards. As far as the 5.0 options, I haven't dropped Ramsdale, even though they lost another clean sheet. And that's simply because the expected numbers are still so good for Arsenal. And I think that was just such a key and blatant mistake from Gabriel that you really wouldn't have seen Ramsdale on another day actually lose his clean sheet. He actually made 1 or 2 good saves in the Fulham game, and I don't think he really was in danger of losing the clean sheet until Gabriel made an absolute monumental mess up. And somehow Gabriel still ended up with more points than Ramsdale in the game. So that's as things are. With Mendy, I would say the Chelsea defense just simply hasn't really lived up to our expectations. And potentially that will change when Fofana comes in. But the Liverpool game is actually closing in quite soon. And I do think with the backline, another thing too is it will take time for things to gel. It will take time for example, Fofana to find the right positions, to actually also play alongside Koulibaly and Thiago Silva, and to see what Tuchel actually does with the team going forwards, and how fast, let's say, Fofana gets nailed. So I would say Mendy drops and Sa actually rises as an option. So far, Wolves have once again posted very good numbers. We actually expected, or at least I expected, that their defensive numbers would be quite good this season, because I didn't really expect them to play all out guns blazing as a, four at the back team and consistently play teams off the park with attacking football. I do think that they are actually still quite defensive and actually still looking to counter on teams. So for me, Wolves actually have still arisen as an interesting defensive option through Sa making a lot of great saves, and that's exactly what he's doing so far. So Sa's one option I would say would marry up to Mendy, whereas Ramsdale with his defensive numbers, at least on the expected level, have been so good that I still think he's a better option than Mendy, and we've already discussed Pope last week. So that's how things have changed for the goalkeepers, and that's going to be the cheat sheet for this week. I hope you guys have a wonderful week ahead, and I'll see you guys very shortly.